Okay, final panel of the conference of the day. We're really happy to be here, and we're just going to get it started. But first, I just want to ask everyone here how, and also to encourage some audience participation, because I know it's the sort of last hour here. How familiar on a scale of like 1 to 5, so hold up fingers, 1 to 5, would you say you are with the state of sort of U.S. Platform regulation, U.S. social media regulation, tech policy generally? 2, 5, 3, 5. Okay, 2s. Seems like we have like an average 4, 3.5 maybe. Great. Okay. Well, we're just gonna get it started. My name is Chloe Autio. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm honored to have been asked by the organizer of the conference to moderate and put together this panel focused on psychology and technology, metrics, and ultimately public policy, which is where I spend a lot of my time. I run my own consultancy where I advise governments and industry and intergovernmental organizations on various projects related to AI policy and governance. That could include policy development or implementing governance frameworks. My background is in responsible AI and working on public policy at emerging tech companies, particularly on AI for the last almost 10 years or so. And I'm really happy to be here with these 3 individuals to my left who each have really unique perspectives and experiences at the intersection of all of the issues that we have been talking about today. Natasha Ahmed brings a lot of experience from industry, government, and she's focused on youth psychology right now. Jonathan Teubner hails from academia, but he also has a platform, which you can talk about during the panel, so also provides some industry perspectives. And Marshall Van Alstyne here from BU is an expert in the economics of information, and he's done a lot of work on studying sort of information policy and economics. Just to give everybody sort of a preview of the discussion, we're going to cover roughly 3 topics, and that'll be followed by about 10 minutes of Q&A. So hold your questions. We'd love to make this a little bit more participatory kind of at the end here. But the 3 things we're going to cover are sort of first the known issues with technology platforms at a really high level, including misinformation, psychological and behavioral impacts, and obviously sort of broader societal and geopolitical harms. Again, things we've been talking about for most of the weekend. We'll then talk about mechanisms for understanding and measuring these topics in the context of governance, and conclude with a discussion about how platform data and governance metrics can be leveraged to inform and advance platform regulation. So, how do we work with policymakers? How do we get them to understand a lot of the things that you all are working on and really drive forward this conversation about platform regulation and governance? So with that, Marshall, I'm going to start with you to just kind of give us some table setting, this problem space that we've all been talking about, but to share your perspective from the economic point of view. And I know you're not focused on psychology, you're not a psychologist, a lot of different than a lot of folks here. But I'd love to just hear from you, what are some of the market failures that sort of led us here and are contributing to the problems that we're experiencing with social media platforms and platforms generally?
So let's see if this is working. Now I think it's working.
Yeah.
One of the ways I like to think of platforms is as governance models for actually helping to regulate some of the market failures that we observe out there. So is there information asymmetry? Are you going to get a good deal or a bad deal? Is someone going to lie to you about a product? Or another one is actually the externalities. Sometimes you can think of platforms like Google or Amazon or others, or Netflix or others, as a large-scale aggregation of small-scale network effects. Your search might make her search better, or your movie-watching behavior might make someone else's movie-watching behavior better. That's an externality. Social networks clearly are externalities. They get more valuable as more people use them. But it's the orchestration of those externalities that makes a big difference. It's wonderful when those are positive. So you're creating social value. You're actually creating a better match, getting a better product. You're getting content created. But it's horrible when those externalities are negative. That's when there's insurrection in the United States or Brazil. There are riots in the United Kingdom. There's genocide in Myanmar. There's judicial interference. Those are the kinds of things and damages that are happening off-platform that they are not internalizing. It also provides a framework for why this actually gets to be so interesting and also so problematic. Consider the case of free speech and misinformation as an interesting case. So it's one thing if you and I exchange comments about what's going on in the world. It's another if it's actually then causing damage off-platform, if they're threatening judges, they're threatening poll workers, that's happening off-platform. So the platforms are not internalizing those damages. I think for those of you holding up the 4 or 5 fingers, the platforms aren't liable for the content that the users post, but they're also not liable for their editorial decisions about what their users post. So in some sense, one of the things that the platforms is doing, they're waiting for someone to drop the match, and they're pouring on the gasoline so they can sell ads while people watch the fire as the neighborhood burns down. So it's an interesting shift in the responsibilities. The problem, again, from an externality perspective, again, one of these market failures, is market failures require intervention. In the normal course of things, you expect government to intervene. But in the case of free speech, the First Amendment forbids government intervention in the case of speech. So if you're turning things over to the marketplace of ideas to self-correct, it ain't going to happen, because markets do not self-correct market failures. So that creates the setting, if you will, within which a large number of different things need to happen, and we need to find alternate mechanisms to see if we can address some of those challenges.
Yeah, thanks. So we're going to get to some of those, obviously, in the sort of third arc of this discussion. Jonathan, I'd love for you to sort of tell everybody about Filter Labs, your work there, and share a little bit, too, about some of the things that you observe regarding the data on your platform and changes, particularly in the last sort of 3 to 5 years in the global information environment, particularly in the context of some of the things that Marshall just mentioned, the dynamics.
Yeah, thank you. So Filter Labs, we're based just approximately over there. And so we aggregate thousands, hundreds of thousands of different types of data sources, a lot of it conversational on the web. It's both the major social media platforms, not just the ones that we talk about here in the US, but those globally that are less well known to us or less kind of less prominent features of our conversation. And then in addition to that, a lot of the niche outlets, the places where in some cases they might be a messenger app that is functioning like a social media platform, or their kind of legacy web infrastructure, like web popular forums. We've specialized really in doing this in what we call hard-to-reach areas. Russia has been probably what we're most well known for, kind of monitoring that information environment, but also China, Iran, throughout the Middle East, Africa, and some of these harder ones to kind of access through the standard toolkit. And so I guess and this is something that I've increasingly observed, and I think people are increasingly seeing this now, others out there, is that where conversations are kind of happening in kind of online spaces has shifted pretty significantly in the last 3 to 5 years. I think there's still predominance of conversations on these major platforms, but as that new user growth has not gone negative, but has slowed, you have seen the uptick and the greater growth has been in some of these niche outlets. And that puts a lot of those are regional specific. And so what we do a lot of work around is understanding the information environment and how it differs from region to region around the world. Not everyone's information environment is structured like ours. Some of that is infrastructure, whether it's mobile app based or whether it's a web application, different types of hardware that's available to make it work. All those differ around the world, and they structure the information differently. And government policies also, and whether they are more aggressive, less aggressive in surveilling, in intervening, all of those make these a little bit different. And so what we kind of increasingly do is that you kind of have to understand these in their local, cultural, sociocultural contexts. And with some of these problems that are emerging or have been around for a while, and we've concentrated really in tracking them on the major social media outlets, what we're kind of seeing is that's often where all the trash gets dumped after it's already had an impact. I think this is kind of another piece of the official, I think the official term for what's happening is the enshittification. And that's what we're kind of seeing, and I think some people are moving out into some other outlets, and that's, if you're tracking mis and disinformation sort of thing, and that's what you're trying to do, you're going to have to look outside the major platforms as well as inside them, and that's actually really technically difficult. And that's why I think a lot of people still kind of try to pretend there's some representational value in just looking at the platforms, because it's much easier to look there.
Yeah, really good points. Anyone here, but maybe Jonathan, I'll keep it on you for a second. Can you talk a little about some of the trends that you're observing about how misinformation is spreading across those different platforms, whether it's, especially across these sort of niche, contextual, geographic-based platforms? What are some of the trends and sort of metrics that you're using to observe them?
Yeah, so what we've opted for is to shift away from what's kind of been a network analysis. So the standard way that you track, let's say, just propaganda, I'm not really fond of the terms mis and disinformation, I'm not ever sure what they mean, is that it would be kind of find accounts that you will classify as propaganda accounts, and then track the spread of information through the social graph from that account to another account. That's technically pretty easy to do, and that's one reason why we've done it. But what we've kind of tried to move towards is doing something like narrative analysis of it, and watching them kind of these narratives change, and how certain aspects of the narrative come in and go out, and so we kind of what we call the morphology of the propaganda narrative. That's far more technically demanding and difficult, but you can kind of actually see that in a multi-platform kind of way, and you can actually see that picture better. So those would be some of the things that we do. It's kind of using some new techniques that are now fairly prominent, that you can do something like automated content analysis is the direction that we've gone. And actually, when we talk to a lot of people in the policy space and advise on that, that's what they're increasingly looking for, because they've seen the lack of actionable intelligence from a lot of the network based approaches.
Could I quickly jump in with a question? How would we define the misinformation problem? I have some thoughts on what I think it should be, but if we can't define the problem, we can't solve it. So do you want to quickly jump into what you think? I have a version of what I think it is, but if you want to jump in, what do you think the misinformation problem is?
I usually try not to define it. I think it's defined by a certain set of ideological framings and agendas and purposes there. I don't see any other way around. I don't see a kind of objective definition of it. But what do you seem to have one? Well, I'd like to know yours.
Let me throw something out. So one of them, I think often folks think of this as truth or falsity, judging truth or falsity, and I would argue that's probably not the crux. The reason being, I can use irony or parody and get you to make a better decision. Or I can tell you the truth but omit certain facts and lie to you by omission as a way to do it. Or if you disbelieve my false claims, they're not going to have any effect. But if you disbelieve my true claims, you could lead to a terrible consequence. So truth or falsity isn't it. I would tend to define it as either decision error, so in your ideological sense, you've tried to mislead someone to do that, or externality harms that are occurring off platform. So either of those two things. decision error born of the information put out there, or harms caused to third parties by actions taken from that information.
I just quickly to follow up here, and we can move. I don't know anyone who uses veracity as a very helpful, kind of criterion right now on it, because there are obviously overt lies out there on it, and those are damaging, but the more kind of insidious ones are what you were saying, this like selective use of truth, these framing, all these other things. Classic propaganda, from the the 20s through the 50s, all these propagandists were saying, like, don't lie to people. That's a bad way to do this if you really want to persuade a population. And I think we've somehow like got ourselves in this box of thinking about it in this like truth falsity framework, which
I think I would
you
point
can see why, but it's not very helpful if you want to understand the phenomena of propaganda.
I agree with that. The only point I mentioned is Jen Allen's research yesterday pointed out that the platforms are flagging truth or falsity, but it's the stuff that's not flagged that was 50 times more damaging. So that's just a way of thinking about the issue.
Important, and a lot of ways to define it. I will say that I think for people in policy contexts and maybe otherwise, and particularly in the context of generative AI, the way that people think about misinformation is relative to disinformation in the sense that it is, unintentionally spread false information, just at a very basic level. So, and we don't need to use that definition. I think this conversation was helpful, but Tosh, anything to add on how you think about misinformation?
I think about misinformation really when my mom sends me a WhatsApp and it's about, someone who's waiting outside who's actually going to burgle my house. Now, look, I think that I have, to your point, misinformation at a, individual level is highly emotive, and it captures emotions, right? So the reason why we believe these things is because we feed into it. My mom sending me that feeds on my fears of someone burgling my house, and so I think that is on a very micro level, it affects us. That's why it's really hard to measure on platforms. When we're thinking it from a platform perspective, we can only think of whether can we fact check this? Is this true or is this false? Take it down if it's false. And so I think that's the way I think about it. And yes, disinformation feels very intentional. Misinformation feels like my mom is caring for me, right? And that's why it spreads so quickly, and that's why it matters so much. So yeah, not to puncture your debate there, but I just thought I'll bring my mom into it because she really does. She's a big spreader of misinformation. Shout out to Yasmin.
No, that's helpful. I think we all have a Yasmin in our lives,
Yeah,
right?
we do.
Somebody. Okay, so now that we've sort of talked about the problem space, went a little bit deeper on misinformation, obviously we want to pivot to sort of governance and solutions. And we all know that metrics are critical for any kind of governance, platform governance, measuring how well it's working. But I want to ask everyone on the panel here, how do we develop metrics that are resilient to sort of the changes that we're observing about how people are using these platforms?
Can I go first?
Please.
Okay, so I've been thinking about this question so much because in my work, so I'll just give you a bit of context of who I am, how I got here. I also live way over there in Cambridge. As you can tell from the accent, I am from the United Kingdom. I have worked for the civil service, so I was a child online safety policy advisor for what was called the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. And then I moved for an NGO working in children's rights in the digital environment. And then most recently at TikTok, heading up their youth safety and wellbeing global policy team. And now I'm at Harvard doing my postgrad in human development and education. I was in class and we were talking about the quantification of behavior and how do we design metrics that really capture the kind of human experience, and it's hard. And I don't think you can do it without real evidence from mixed methods research or having that qualitative, descriptive research there to inform metrics. And I think that's what I think will kind of capture your point, is that we need to be working with researchers who have done research, qualitative research, in order to inform quantitative metrics. So really centering the human experience within that. So like at TikTok, you know, we would have metrics on, you know, how much time spent on the platform, but that doesn't really tell us about you know, healthy engagement. It just tells us about how much time is spent. So perhaps if we want a young person to spend less time, we would say, okay, we would have design notifications so to keep them off the platform, or basically lock the platform so they are spending like more time sleeping rather than on the platform. I think that's really important. So like we connect quantitative and qualitative to design those metrics. So very important there to be working with researchers.
I guess, I mean, just pick up on that point. I guess I've put a lot of metrics before policymakers all the time. Always very disappointed in their response. But when you put before them some account of like the actual human interaction within that context, it's really important. It's really impactful there. And
Can you give, sorry to interrupt, can you give an example of that?
I mean, I guess if you were to, we were tracking something in the region of Kursk in Russia, where Ukraine invaded the offensive in early August. We had all these metrics around it, talking to, it was people in Europe who were tracking this stuff, as well as the Ukrainians, the US policymakers. They were all very interested in these high-level metrics initially. That's kind of what they asked for, like tell us, quantify this, the kind of Russian information operation around it to try to kind of confuse the Russians in that area. But actually, when you actually started to like tell them the narratives they use and the responses of people, that's when they could like actually like understand the actual information there. And then it was only after that that they could actually take on and understand the quantified side of it. And I think, I guess what I tell our team that does a lot of the policy outreach is that, you know, sometimes the reports get us a meeting. We put together a rapid report for someone who asked for some information, but it's really in there telling them, talking to them and answering their questions, that it's far better. And it's only after that that they can actually understand that. And it's also, you just have to be very, like, you have to lower your expectations when you're dealing with anyone in this policy space, as well, in my experience there, that they're just not going to digest as much quantified information as you think they are going to. Even the ones who are in those positions who you think they would, they're not. Humans just don't do that generally. But you can kind of like help them like bridge that gap a little bit with representational accounts and stories there. I don't know if that was your experience.
No, I agree.
British
I'll pass to Marshall. I think the through line throughout this is narratives and stories, and I think it's so important. You know, when you said, do you have an example of that? We understand things when we're told stories, right? And so if you're giving someone metrics, they're like, well, what does this mean? And if we can speak the language of policymakers and engineers and be able to connect those two together through telling a story, they're more likely to buy in. So if we can do that, that's really important for measuring human behavior and as well as impact.
Just one thing one counterexample here that's really important is when you're dealing with KPIs within a company and you have a set of engineers and you have these metrics, they know how to build towards that. And so those are actually really important within companies, less important outside of companies. And setting up the right metrics internally is really important, and that's what we, those of us who run companies, that's what we target those every day. and we have them, up in our offices.
So it's funny, Chloe asked this question. I hadn't thought about this. So it was only yesterday I had to think about this question. And I would have to pick up exactly on what Jonathan was just saying a moment ago. There's one thing for the companies to do it versus what's happening outside. So I would pick up on starting with the platform metrics. We heard that today from Luis van Aan. They gave you very explicit internal metrics: engagement, profits, learning. Those 3 metrics out there. Those are different than the metrics a regulator would use. So I would think one question we need to ask is, metrics mean what to whom? So we need to be very precise. They're the internal metrics, exactly as Jonathan was just telling us what the company's doing, but we also need to think of the metrics for the users or the others themselves. I want to emphasize, we should be thinking about ecosystem level metrics, not just individual level metrics. To give another example from the talks today, there's the LLM used to see if you can improve mental health. That's one metric. A consequence of optimizing that could be you eliminate the therapist. But maybe one of your other metrics should also be, can you make the therapist more effective so the whole ecosystem is better? So we want to bump up a level and look at that to see if there's another way to cover the whole system, not just one component of it. And again, in Luis van Aan's case, when is it that the optimization of one internal 50 out of 50 is hurting the metric of someone else in that 50? You need to jump up a level to look at the ecosystem. Then to give 1 or 2 other ideas, I do think a general metric we should be considering is the opportunity cost metric. I don't know how many of you heard TikTok has just been sued for causing addiction. And there's a literal wonderful quote about the opportunity cost where they're trying to get kids not to eat, not to sleep, and not to participate with the people in the room. Those are all opportunity costs that could be measured as a version of that. Or there's another metric I heard, I got to give credit to O'Reilly and Mazzucato on this. Really interesting idea. Maybe the platform's a measure of monopoly power is often the ability to change prices without loss of revenue. Or in this case, maybe it's the ability to deviate from the ideal ordering relative to customer preference without loss of revenue, in which case what you're doing is you're exploiting the user in order to capture more revenue or do something else. So quickly look at ecosystem level metrics, look at opportunity costs, and not just individual components. I think we have to look across the board.
Yeah, great thoughts. Tosh, Jonathan, either of you have any other sort of metrics besides the ones that typically motivate platforms?
I think just picking up on Jonathan's point, I want to corroborate that, because working within any company, you do have KPIs. But I worked in policy, and policy is notoriously vague. How do you capture the human experience in a metric? So the way that platforms do it, like we have violation rates. So how many times a piece of content has violated a community guideline? That's one. How many times has this platform taken down this piece of content before anyone else has seen it? How many times has this piece of content been liked, shared, saved? And those are really important for engagement. But like I said, going back to my original point, is that we want to go beyond that, and we want to capture the human experience. And one thing that I really would love, future focus, is capturing a digital wellness metric. That's something that we speak about quite often. Marshall, you talked about TikTok being sued, TikTok causing addiction. I don't know about the causation point of it. Correlation and causation are 2 different things, and I think the correlation point, potentially, yes, we can debate on that. But I do think there needs to be more work and research done in this particular area. I would love a digital wellness metric across the board to capture what does addiction look like and manifest on platforms, and how can we measure that, and how can we measure wellness?
Just to pick up on that point, one direction, maybe some of you know probably more about this than I do, but Jack Dorsey had a metric that was pretty complicated, no longer exists, but was the health. What's the health of the conversation on Twitter? That is, I think, going in the same direction. And those are the types of metrics that, I guess, to put more of my academic hat on of what we do within the Human Flourishing program at Harvard to try to understand how these are conducive to certain kind of public health outcomes. are we want things that aren't just tracking the kind of negative outcomes. We want to see which platforms and which activities are correlating with positive public health outcomes there. And so those are really hard to develop, and they're hard to maintain too. You know, Dorsey attempted to try to put it up there along with, kind of his quarterly profits, as this is going to be just as important. Obviously, the story of Twitter is complicated, and I think complicated from ways that are not always appreciated from outside the industry there, because it was kind of a dumpster fire even when Dorsey ran it. And so, Musk rightly should bear some of the blame for this, but it's not all of his fault there. But so those are some things going for. But I think the one that we want to really avoid incentivizing companies, and I don't have a really good answer for this, is that time on platform metric, captivating them and keeping them on the platform. Anyone that's using time on platform as one is probably inducing negative outcomes there. And I would love to see some alternatives that also align with the business models. And that's the difficulty, is time on platform aligns so well with ads business models right now. So I don't know.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And I think the quality versus quantity debate is really important here because, for kids, it's not great if you spend 20 hours on your phone and watching TV. You need to get some sleep, you need to eat. But what is the quality of what you're engaging with is super important there. And I do agree with that. Like, if businesses are just measuring time spent, that's their priority. So can we also measure how many times a young person has watched a video that encourages positive well-being and then goes off the platform? That's other ways of measuring human behavior that is positive. Can we measure positive engagement? So if they've seen a particular piece of content that encourages them to go outside, can we also look at that? And I think, obviously, for me, something that's really important to me is a youth experience. So are young people also engaging with civil activism and, thinking about the climate and things like that? So that is a more positive engagement environment that we would love to measure. And I don't work for TikTok anymore, but if I did, I would love to put those metrics in front of them and say, can we explore this?
I love the systemic view of thinking of also climate and also getting outside. And that, again, the ecosystem's view of health.
Yeah. When we first spoke, in addition to sort of thinking about metrics along the lines of promoting human flourishing or well-being, I think it was you, Tash, who mentioned sort of thinking about a paradigm for a rights-based approach to metrics. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about that here and how you thought about it, I think, during your time in the government, or, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks, Chloe. So I worked for an NGO called Five Rights Foundation. There's three aspects of their work. One was data protection. One was child-centered design, so thinking about the design of a platform but centering children in that. And the final one was digital rights, so child's rights in the digital environment. And prior to that, I was working for the UK government, where we would speak a lot about the best interest of the child. Now, that's a really vague term, but it is Article 3 of the United Nations Convention's Rights of the Child, and so it's an international, rights-based framework in where we think about children's rights. Not necessarily applicable to the digital environment, but there are general comments, like the General Comment 25, which does apply those particular rights into the digital environment. The problem with rights-based frameworks is that they're often quite vague and difficult to apply to a digital environment. So working in the UK government, it was really helpful when I was working with Baroness Kidron, who put the amendment in for the Data Protection Act, where she proposed the Age-Appropriate Design Code. The Age-Appropriate Design Code, you might know it as the Children's Code. It has influenced the Californian Code here in the US, but it has 15 standards, the first standard being the best interest of the child. What does that mean? But thankfully, the 14 standards that followed it actually have applicable ways to think about a rights-based approach. And so one of them, for example, data minimization. And a rights-based approach in this regard is context-specific. So it was really looking at protecting children's data. So the way I see it is, can we design rights-based frameworks that are context-specific and applicable? Now, TikTok, I'm going to use TikTok as an example again. It's a global platform, which means that it had to adhere to the age-appropriate design code and be regulated by the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK. If they didn't conform or comply with any of the 15 standards, they would be, subject to a 4% fine of their global annual turnover. That's a lot, I guess. So I think that way of connecting policy, a rights-based framework, and industry innovation, because you had to comply with it, is a way that I think that we can think about rights in the digital context.
So I'm a huge fan of the rights-based approach. I think this is a great way for restoring power to users in a way that they can reclaim agency and reclaim value. Let's see if I can give you an example. We've been working on something that we call an in situ data right. The idea here is that you'd be able to import any algorithm to your own data where it's resident in the infrastructure, as opposed to taking your data out of the infrastructure. Key benefits of this are it preserves context, so you're not removed, it's also current at any given time. But now think of what happens. Imagine on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, you could choose your own filter. You could choose the BBC, the Fox News, Breitbart, CNN filter. You don't have to suffer whatever harassment Mark Zuckerberg or Musk chooses for your filter. You choose the filter that you want. In that case, you could have a friendly filter, or if you want the hate speech, or if you want something that has gun rights in it, that can be there. But if you want something for your kids, it'll be a different set of filters in there. This also lets users subset into advertising categories. It makes it easier for advertisers to reach them. But then something else also happens. Imagine you could import the Google ad filter into your Facebook profile. Well, why would you do that? Well, it's because Google might share a fraction of their ad revenues in order to gain access to your Facebook revenue. But then what happens is Facebook says, well, crap, I don't want you using the Google filter in our infrastructure. We'll share our ad revenue. What's happened? We've created competition on top. You become the bottleneck, and now you get to reclaim some of the value from your own data. So not only do you regain agency in terms of what you're going to be shown, you get a share of that value. I think this rights-based approach actually helps in both of those dimensions.
Really interesting reactions.
It's kind of a non-starter for a corporation, I guess.
Well, the same. This is why we need regulation, right? Google isn't, or Facebook isn't going to volunteer to make this happen, right? So this is where it needs to be.
Huge burden on the engineering side.
So, well, this is APIs. Blue Sky is already trying to do this kind of thing as one element of it. Now, if we wanted to restore rights, let me back up for a second. Again, take a market failure perspective. I think a lot of the market failures we're seeing today are different versions of power imbalances that we saw identically a century ago in the industrial era. We got pollution, we got exploitation of labor, we got lobbying. It took a while to get the legislation to reclaim those rights. Now the question is, can we redesign those to perfect that for the information era as distinct from the industrial era? I think we can. And so I think part of our task is to design those systems, understanding how value is created, and then design how it can be recaptured.
I guess just one thing that I've been increasingly convinced by is trying to move towards a subscription model for a lot of these. I think it's a more elegant solution. I think a lot of these, the more complicated it gets, the less likely it's going to be integrated at that level. The equitable access issue is often brought up, but the barriers to entry to creating a platform are relatively low right now. The reason why they're
I'm not sure I agree with that.
the reason why they're high is that you're going to have to get a huge network effect to get the returns that a venture capital kind of invested company is going to require. That's really high. But the infrastructure to build something, a small network, is there. And if you're not actually needing to go out and get those returns, it's there, and you can like turn into small, and this is what we do see, a lot of small subscription networks starting to emerge over time because that's relatively easy to put it together. Right now, it's not like, they're not no-code tools out there yet for it, but you have to know something about it. But it's not the same as, and particularly if you don't require the growth and the returns that you're eventually going to have to promise someone who's in a VC-funded model. It's not going, the technical barriers of entry are lower, and such that if you have more of those and you have them run by subscription methods.
There's a whole bunch of this stuff where I think we agree, but then there's also some things where there's some subtle, interesting differences. So in the infrastructure costs, I think those are way down. Cloud, basic, fixed costs, all those are much easier. So entry from that perspective is much easier. But in terms of generating the network effect, Google has tried 3 times to enter social networks and failed. So we need to get the social networks. Now, in partial agreement, I think one of the things that's interesting is the extent to which some of these niche markets are getting stronger network effects by having really good conversation on a focused topic, as opposed to broad conversation on unfocused topics with weaker network effects, if you will. You're also in line with Paul Romer, Nobel Prize winner, has suggested a subscription model might be superior to an ad model because then you're not focused on engagement all the time because you're not always trying to capture eyeballs. With subscription, you got a fixed revenue. So you're not constantly under that pressure. The problem we face there, and I'm with you, that'd be great. By revealed preference, folks prefer to pay with eyeballs and free time than with cash. So how do we get there? The danger, I think, comes back to what happens when they pay with their time, and then the damage happens off-platform in some other way. So how do we get past the revealed preference to get to the point where that's the option?
Okay, thanks. Staying on this theme about sort of restoring power to users, one of the things that we also talked about, and before we pivot to talking a bit more about practical steps for engaging with policymakers, one of the things we talked about was sort of user education and how to, all of us here are pretty fluent in these, in sort of understanding the nuance between these different metrics and, how they're treated within an organization versus by policymakers and understanding those differences. But most users have no concept of any of that, period. And so what can we do to help educate them about sort of these dynamics? And Marshall, to your point, that trade-off between sort of convenience and rights, in a way. What is our responsibility? What are some of the things that have worked from your point of view to really sort of help users understand how these platforms work?
So 2 thoughts on that, one in favor and one not in favor.
Mm-hmm.
So the one, I'll start with the reverse. The one not in favor is, in the case of misinformation, media literacy programs have been effective at getting folks to challenge misinformation. Unfortunately, they also get folks to be skeptical of accurate information. So they're not as discerning, if you will, as we might like. So media literacy alone is kind of challenging in that perspective. I do think, however, we may be able to create environments, and this is why I'm optimistic about things like in C2 data rights, where competition among different alternatives means one startup, one filter can argue and point out, oh, your filter's crap, I'm going to give you this other feature that, so that the competition will identify the harms and inform the users, as opposed to users having to self-help, if you will. So I think part of it is a design question in technology, such that those who have the information are motivated to disclose it for the benefit of the ecosystem.
Yeah, so I go to the ed school at Harvard, so everything I do is about education. And one thing that I've been really interested in is preparing young people before they get online. So we talk about critical thinking skills and we talk about, empathy or social emotional learning, but often kids are given phones and they're told, okay, go online and you're a digital native, you know how to work it and it's all good. But actually that's not the case, and often they're faced with really challenging situations or pieces of content that affect them in ways that we can't understand because we're not speaking to them about it. So the reason why I think user education is super important, and for platforms and for civil society and parents and families to really engage in educating young people about what the online world is going to offer them, is really, really needed. I would love it to be a curriculum in every single school, and I want it to be taught in families, in families about how to stay safe and empowered online. Now, obviously, I'm talking about youth and families, but there is a responsibility for platforms and civil society to be helping people understand what the benefits and the risks are online. We've given them the internet for free, but young people didn't come to the internet as equal citizens, right? They're developing, and we should respect that. So how do we design user education initiatives to support their development or scaffold their learning? And I think that some platforms have done it really, really well. So I know Google have done be internet safe, or there's some internet citizens kind of program. And I would like to see more of that happening both in and on platform. But education is really important. And often when a minimal viable product is launched, education is like a second thought. It's like, okay, let's just launch it because it looks so cool and it's innovative and wow, everyone's going to use it. But have we told users how to use it? Have we told users about what we're doing with their data, how we're processing their data? Have we told young people what this really means? So you're giving us this information, what do we do with it? And that's where there's an information gap, and that's where education and digital literacy initiatives can fill that gap. So obviously very passionate about it. I'll pass to you.
I don't have too much to add to it. I guess one thing increasingly that I find myself saying when I'm invited to talk, particularly in the public health context, about some of this, is reminding people that these companies are for-profit companies, and helping them put that in the regular mental models they have about the expectations they should have of these platforms should be realistic. And that's where sometimes it feels like they're not always realistic about that. And that is important, to, I think.
Yeah, that's probably why The Social Dilemma on Netflix did so well, because it actually told the story of being oh, well, if you're not buying the product, you are the product, right? And so I think we don't really communicate that to people at the level that needs to be communicated at. Sometimes policymakers and people in tech sit in their ivory tower and don't know how to communicate to the general population about user education. So, you come online and it's free, but is it really free? And if you do want to secure your data, how do you do that? And there are really great ways to actually work with civil society to enable that to happen. But I do agree with you, sometimes it's you're giving your information out and your data, but do you know what these companies are doing with it? So I do agree with you there.
Well, with that, I think one more question, and then we'll audience questions after that. 5 minutes done. Okay, I thought okay, cool. We'll pivot then to the question sort of about policymaker engagement then, and that was something that we've heard a lot about already in the last couple hours or so. But the last question I have, I think, for the group is, how can we sort of better collaborate, or how can we design better collaborations between industry and academia, particularly, industry research arms and researchers like all of you here, to develop sort of better outcomes, information, case studies, whatever it is that will be more useful to policymakers. Jonathan, you talked about, the context, contextualizing, telling stories to this audience to make the information a little bit more salient, just given that they don't have technical expertise or know-how generally. But what are some of the things that we could do sort of together in collaboration to make that a little bit easier?
Yeah, I think there's like a question of strategy with policy makers who are trying to think through certain shifting incentives and things like that. That you have to like ratchet down your expectations considerably. But on the collaboration between industry and academia, this is, and I know some other people here have been thinking through this, is getting involved much earlier in the design and testing process where a company can actually use it. Because if it's too late, a company will see it either as something that, like if you do an assessment of the impact, they're going to see it in two ways, regardless of what they tell you. It's either going to be a threat to them, and they're going to ignore it, or they're going to try to find some reason why it doesn't apply to them, or if they're just going to use it shamelessly to go out and say, hey, look, we're the healthiest place in the world. There's nothing wrong with us. Keep using it. That's what happens often, and companies don't make it easy for you to get involved in the process. And so that's what you end up doing often, and there's a fairly negative cycle that occurs, I think, right now, and we're like seeing it in different contexts around the world. But if you can get involved and get metrics to engineers, and you can figure out how to turn those metrics around in the same time that a product team has to turn something around, we often talk about the agile dev method, about actually having to do these sprints and get this. And can your metrics be that sensitive? Can get information to an engineer that they can change? Because there's a lot of goodwill in companies to do this, particularly on product teams and engineers. It's that the information and the insights don't get there at the right point in time. And so then it turns, I think, fairly negative on the whole, in a way that it's kind of like, if we're serious about it. But this is what it comes down to, like, it's a really, really difficult problem too. And what I tell people is, like, the problem isn't about having new metrics or new frameworks. It's about getting what we know right now in a way that's usable for a company, for a product team. That's much harder. It's an organizational problem, but it's a really, really difficult one in my experience.
Yeah. Marshall?
So I would offer two quick thoughts on this. The first is to connect to what we talked about a moment ago in the rights-based approach. To give you a simple example, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the New York University case where they'd gotten users' permissions to install browser plugins to see how much misinformation people were being shown in advertisement. And Facebook said, no, you can't do that. That's advertiser information. Well, that's bull. Users themselves have access to this data, so why shouldn't they be allowed to analyze what misinformation they are being shown? If they had rights, then they could grant us as researchers the capacity to benchmark and to see that, or we could work with them and negotiate with that. So I think the rights-based approach is one stepping stone. The second point is, I actually think we need to pop up one layer and actually ask, how do we design better ecosystems to police these things, as opposed to asking the regulators to step in and do it. To give an example, a lot of discussion around the Digital Markets Act in the EU was about positioning an internal regulator at the gatekeeping companies. Well, how often is an individual going to be able to understand exactly what's going on in machine learning algorithms? It's rare. Better to create an ecosystem in which competitors can keep an eye on competitors and report on their misdeeds through a rights-based approach, so the market becomes self-correcting with the parties that have the best information, rather than having government that may not have the best information do it. So I think, again, rights-based approach, and then create ecosystems that are self-correcting.
Okay, that and timing and?
Yeah, so my only point is I would love researchers to be both the conduit and mediators between tech and policymakers. They're the ones who understand both platform design and human behavior, but the languages that tech platforms and policymakers speak are different. And so researchers are the conduit, and they are like I said, the mediators. So they remain slightly neutral in the sense that they really want to be evidence-based, but they also want to make some change. And that's what policymakers they really care about, societal change and societal impact. So if we can inspire more researchers to be that conduit, I think that's what's needed.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, thank you all so much. I think we'll just do a few questions, if that's okay, and then we'll wrap up for the day. Anyone have questions for this group?
Thank you all for the conversation. I think it's really interesting to think about how would we quantify some of these effects, and what are some kinds of systems for better regulation. It seems like, let's go back to the time-based kind of approach, or the opportunity cost approach of eating, sleeping, and that kind of analysis, or that accounting, right? So, as I think as Natasha said, one of the problems is that we're not really sure how, there's like a variety of quality of content on platforms. So if my children are watching an educational program like Sesame Street or Number Blocks on the BBC, right? Like I don't feel bad tomorrow that they watch 20 minutes or like 30 minutes of that, right? But if they're watching something like Coco Melon, right? Like that, I'm not sure if people without children don't know what that is, but it's like, they literally test like how much time on screen are eyeballs, right? And it's just like lowest common denominator, right? So in that kind of case, like that kind of time usage would be really bad. And so part of the problem is that it's very hard to quantify sort of what the psychological or educational or like constructive impact is of what we're doing on platforms, and what the destructive impact is, in the sense that we don't have things like a nutritional label for content consumed. And so if we were to think about like what would be the nutrition label that you would try to construct for media content, right? I'm just curious, like, I'm sure news organizations have some kind of level of that. Is that like the framework that we should be thinking about, these nutrition labels, or is there a better kind of way of conceptualizing that?
Firstly, I love that idea. I think it's correlates or similar to content classification, or like, ratings of films and things like, you look at Netflix and you see the rating of a particular film. Now, a lot of platforms are trying to embed that in the system based on developmental stages. So, if your child is 13 to 15, we're going to give them this sort of content. I think that approach would be really interesting, and try to embed that across platforms. It's happening, but not happening at a quick rate. And I think that's more transparency is needed on platforms around what is good content, what is educational content, because it also is based on societal and regional expectations of what is educational or not. I mean, in some states, I know there are banning of certain books. So I think that there is that element of content classification needed, but as well as transparency of that innovation. But I really like the idea of a nutritional label, and maybe a researcher here could work with a company to implement that.
I was a part of a conversation about 4 years ago to do a nutrition label, and it faltered where we couldn't agree on what went on that could be universal across all the platforms. And this is maybe something that refers back to the educational thing, is that platforms are different. We kind of like bucketed all as social media. They induce different behaviors. There's different types of information, different type of media all the time. And it's a really interesting challenge, but ultimately I think it's one that's gonna have to be done in the public domain completely that way. But it's gonna take a lot of resources to do. Is what, from about 4 years ago, it was kind of a conversation with some VCs doing it. And they were going to prepare to put in some eye-watering amounts of money for it. This was post-COVID, thinking through that information environment. And I'm not sure the US government, my government, really understands how much money it takes.
There's a data nutrition labeling project at Berkman from a few years ago. I'm not a part of it, but maybe relevant for this thread that's worth looking at. Different question. I wanted to push on a little bit the rights-based framework versus the public health argument. I see those as not speaking to each other particularly well, and I'm 100% could not be more on board with the need for metrics to end up at the level of line engineers' OKRs. That's been a lot of my work's focus, and sort of coming at this from both having worked in policy and government and also in industry sort of settings, running a tech company. My own view is I don't think rights-based versions are particularly good at getting into that kind of a conversion-based structure. So I'm curious if you have a different view of it where that kind of a top-down rule could work. I think there are cases where it works great, but for the public health narrative where you're trying to constrain an externality that is very nebulous and very hard to measure, how does that work?
I'm guessing that was directed at me. Don't know. Interesting. It's an interesting question. So let's focus on the tension that I'm anticipating within your question. I'm a little bit, certainly in the United States, I'm a little bit wary of paternalistic approaches where the state is deciding what's in your best interest, or any centralized system where a centralized system is deciding what's in your best interest, as distinct from a framework which allows for agency, so you can decide what's in your best interest. Now, I'm very sensitive to the second part of your question, which is dealing with the externalities. For reference, it usually would then require some state intervention to deal with the market failure, which is itself an externality. One of the things I've been working on separately are tools to try to cause those externalities to be internalized and restore market efficiency. That's a much longer conversation. My larger point is simply, one, my own view, and this is a philosophical view, is I prefer the agency model and self-help to someone else determining on your behalf. That's a very Millsian view of how things should actually be run. The second part I'm quite sensitive to, which is how do we deal with the externality problem? And as a matter of research, that's something I'm personally working on to see if we can restore a rights-based approach using the theories of Ronald Coase to try to make that happen. That's a decentralized market as opposed to the Pigovian solution, which is a centralized market, as a way to look at the problem.
I think a rights-based framework leaves room for innovation. And I think when I think about the age-appropriate design code, the first standard is the best interest of the child, but the next 14 is how to potentially apply those standards into digital platforms. And how to do that was left in the hands of, as you know, I loved your presentation, but was left in the hands of digital platforms. So what does it mean by nudge techniques or limiting nudge techniques? So in the case of TikTok, we said, right, okay, kids need sleep, right? So we're going to stop notifications after 9 p.m. for teens. That is a way of using a rights-based framework to be innovative, but also ensure compliance with a particular piece of regulation. So I do agree, there is a tension there, and I think that needs to be explored, but there's still a way that a framework can be applicable and be innovative and creative at the same time.
Great. Thanks, Tash. Thanks, Jonathan and Marshall. Can we give them a round of applause?